a plumbing problem at Glen Canyon Dam brings a new threat to the Colorado River system.
Releasing water from Lake Powell at the Glen Canyon Dam as part of an environmental restoration project.
Before engineers opened the floodgates, the Grand Canyon had been quiet for decades, a still sun-baked scar carved by a once mighty river. But when they unleashed a man-made deluge to mimic nature, the results rippled far beyond what anyone expected. Sandbars returned, ecosystems stirred, and something far older and more dangerous began to rise. A flood on purpose. At 6:20 a.m. on March 26, 1996, a group of engineers gathered atop Glen Canyon Dam, surrounded by desert silence and concrete. Beneath them, steel jet tubes waited like loaded cannons. With a final check, the first valve turned. From the side of the dam, an eruption of white water exploded into the canyon below. Within minutes, the Colorado River surged with a force not seen in decades. The flow reached 335,000 gallons per second, enough to fill an Olympic pool every 2 seconds. This was not a disaster, it was a deliberate act. For the first time in history, humans tried to simulate a natural flood, on purpose. The goal? To undo the damage that other human hands had caused. Decades earlier, the dam had severed the river's natural rhythm, silencing the seasonal floods that once sculpted the Grand Canyon. The land downstream had grown dusty and still, its beaches vanishing, its wildlife struggling to adapt. Now, the floodwaters returned with thunderous urgency, lifting sand buried for generations and shaking boulders loose from canyon walls. But what seemed like restoration was, in truth, an experiment. One that tested not just the canyon's resilience, but our own ability to mimic the wild forces we had long tried to tame. Why? The river went silent. The Colorado River once pulsed with seasonal rhythm, rising each spring as snowmelt thundered down from the Rockies. For millions of years, this annual flood sculpted the Grand Canyon, carving terraces, building sandbars, and feeding entire ecosystems. But in 1963, everything changed. The completion of Glen Canyon Dam, 720 feet of concrete and steel, transformed the river into something unrecognizable. Upstream, Lake Powell expanded into a massive reservoir. Downstream, the river slowed, its power shackled by turbines and electricity demands. The natural floods stopped, and with them, the sand and silt that once nourished the canyon disappeared. In just a few decades, beaches that had existed for centuries began to erode. The river, once muddy and unruly, turned cold and clear. Scientists began calling it hungry water, a flow so devoid of sediment it scoured the riverbed, stripping away what little remained. But erosion wasn't the only consequence. Without fresh sediment, native cottonwoods and willows struggled to grow. Invasive plants like tamarisk and Bermuda grass flourished instead, transforming once vibrant ecosystems into hostile environments. Wildlife declined. Ancient archaeological sites, long protected beneath shifting dunes, were left exposed to wind and rain. What's more, the canyon's flow now danced to a man-made rhythm. When city dwellers flipped on lights, the dam released water. When demand dropped, so did the river. This artificial pulse confused the wildlife, destabilized banks, and decoupled the river from the seasonal cycles that had once defined it. The damage wasn't dramatic all at once. It was quiet, cumulative, and nearly invisible until it became undeniable. By the 1990s, a growing chorus of scientists realized they weren't witnessing a slow evolution. They were watching the canyon unravel, and doing nothing was no longer an option. The 1983 catastrophe that changed everything. More than a decade before the 1996 flood experiment, nature staged its own rehearsal and nearly tore the dam apart in the process. The summer of 1983 brought record snowmelt, cascading down from the Rockies with stunning speed. Lake Powell began to rise faster than engineers had predicted. With panic mounting, they opened the spillways, enormous tunnels cut into the rock beside Glen Canyon Dam to release the pressure. The result was more violent than anyone imagined. Water screamed through the spillways at over 726,000 gallons per second. But soon, something strange and terrifying happened. the outflow turned a vivid, unnatural red. Engineers quickly realized the water wasn't just churning through the tunnels, it was shredding them. The flow was so intense that it generated microscopic bubbles that exploded with incredible force, a phenomenon known as cavitation. These collapsing bubbles acted like micro-detonations, ripping apart concrete linings and gouging deep into the sandstone itself. For a time, there were serious fears that the tunnels and the dam might collapse. Miraculously, catastrophe was avoided. But when the floodwaters receded, the aftermath revealed an unexpected silver lining. Beaches downstream had reappeared. Invasive vegetation was cleared. Fish habitats were revitalized. The flood, despite its danger, had restored parts of the ecosystem in ways scientists hadn't anticipated. That unplanned disaster planted a radical idea. What if we could harness the violence of water, not to destroy, but to heal? That question would shape the next era of Colorado River management, the hidden cost of healing. By the early 2000s, the man-made floods became more than a wild experiment. They became policy. In 2012, the United States government formally committed to conducting high-flow releases whenever enough sediment accumulated in tributaries like the Paria River. These engineered floods were framed as ecological medicine, reshaping beaches, aiding native fish, and restoring habitats carved away by time and turbines. But this therapy came with a price. Every flood meant rerouting water around the dam's power-generating turbines. With each roar of the jet tubes, electricity production dropped, and energy providers lost millions in potential revenue. In desert cities fueled by this hydroelectricity, the lights stayed on, but at a cost passed quietly through the grid. What seemed like a triumph for the river became a thorn in the side of energy markets. And then came a more unsettling discovery. In 2018, scientists from the United States Geological Survey identified that sediment trapped behind Glen Canyon Dam wasn't just sand. Layered within it were persistent organic pollutants, POPs, chemical remnants from decades of agricultural runoff, industrial discharge, and atmospheric deposition. These toxic compounds, including PCBs and organochlorine pesticides, bind tightly to fine-grained sediment and can remain chemically active for generations. When a high-flow event dislodges this sediment, those pollutants don't stay buried. They can drift downstream, entering the food web and accumulating in fish, birds, and even humans. Suddenly, the act of mimicking nature carried a hidden danger. The unintentional release of chemicals that the natural floods of old never had to carry. The river was healing, yes, but not without bleeding. This revelation reframed the floods. They were not only experiments in ecology, but in toxicology. Each surge now posed a complex question. How do you save a river without poisoning the life within it? Secrets in the stone. For some who know the Grand Canyon best, not as scientists, but as storytellers, explorers, and river guides, the river's changing pulse carries meanings beyond erosion and energy grids. Alongside the ecological and political debate, another current flows through the canyon, one of secrecy, myth, and speculation. The legend traces back to 1909, when the Arizona Gazette published a strange account of an explorer named G.E. Kincaid. According to the story, Kincaid claimed to have discovered a vast underground citadel hidden deep in the canyon walls, filled with Egyptian-style relics, mummies, and artifacts of unknown origin. The Smithsonian denied involvement, and no verifiable evidence was ever found. Yet the tale persisted, passed down in hushed tones and footnotes, gaining traction among fringe historians and canyon mystics. Decades later, some began to whisper that Glen Canyon Dam wasn't built solely for electricity. They suggested it acted as a literal plug, blocking or flooding access to hidden chambers beneath Lake Powell. In this view, the floods might serve a dual purpose, not only restoring sandbanks, but discreetly burying evidence whenever water levels drop too low and curious hikers wander too far. There is no scientific proof for these claims, but in the silence of side canyons, where light barely touches the rock, the absence of answers can echo as loudly as truth. What is certain is that the Colorado River has always guarded stories, some carved into stone by ancient hands, others suspended between geology and imagination. Drought, dead pools, and digital thirst. As speculation swirled through the canyon's shadows, a far more tangible crisis tightened its grip on the American West. The Colorado River was shrinking, not gradually, but decisively. Tree ring studies later confirmed that the region had entered its worst megadrought in at least 12 centuries, a drying so severe it dwarfed anything recorded in modern history. Reservoirs fell year after year, their bathtub rings creeping higher along the canyon walls. Lake Powell, once a symbol of human mastery over water, approached a frightening threshold known as dead pool. At that point, water levels would drop below the dam's intake pipes, halting power generation and threatening downstream flow entirely. In response, experimental floods were suspended for 5 years, not because they failed, but because every drop had become too valuable to spare. Yet scarcity was not evenly shared. While residents were urged to abandon lawns and shorten showers, vast data centers rose across the desert. These digital fortresses, essential to cloud computing and artificial intelligence, consume millions of gallons of water annually for cooling. To many observers, this contradiction felt less like mismanagement and more like prioritization. Some began to argue that the crisis wasn't solely climatic, but structural. The rules governing the river, drafted in 1922 during an unusually wet period, promised more water than the river could ever reliably deliver. Today, 7 states and Mexico remain locked in negotiations, each reluctant to surrender allocations written into law, but no longer grounded in reality. The river was not just running dry, it was colliding with a century of assumptions that no longer held. It took a man-made flood to remember what a real river feels like. But when we try to mimic nature, we're also testing our memory of balance, of respect, of consequence. Would you flood it again? Let us know below, and subscribe for more buried truths revealed.